If the edges on your crochet projects are looking a little wonky and you're wondering how the heck do I keep them straight, you're going to love today's video. I'm showing you how to get straight edges on your crochet projects using any stitch, and we're keeping it beginner friendly. Hi there, I'm Leisha from With Love Leisha. Let's jump in. You can really transform your edges and get nice clean edges with just a couple simple tips and tweaks. So I'm going to share 3 beginner-friendly tips that I use on a regular basis regardless of the stitch I'm using, and you can use what works for you based on what you're crocheting. Tip number 1, use stitch markers. One of the most common reasons that beginners get wonky edges or uneven edges is because they're not counting their stitches correctly, or they're not placing their first and last stitch in the correct place. Stitch markers are a really easy way of fixing that problem. If you don't have the correct stitch count, you're going to end up getting a weird bump if you're adding too many, or your work will cave in if you have too few stitches. If you're not placing your stitch in the correct place, you're going to have the same problem, either a weird bump at the edge or an indent. So marking your first and last stitch with a stitch marker is a great way of solving that problem. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I have my starting chain here. Now I'm going to place a half double crochet. This works with any stitch. I'm just using a half double crochet because it's one of my favorites. I'm placing a half double crochet into that third chain from the hook. Now right when I place my first stitch, I'm going to grab a stitch marker and see this V at the top. I'm going to stick it in there. So now I know that this is my first stitch. I'm just going to go ahead and work down the row. I'm placing my last stitch. And I'm going to go ahead and place a stitch marker right there. You can use anything you want as a stitch marker. A scrap piece of yarn that is a different color from the yarn you're crocheting your project with, a hairpin, a safety pin, I mean anything really. You just need something that marks off that spot. Okay, so now when we turn our row, if you're using a turning chain, I'm going to go ahead and I've got my turning chain. Now I'm turning, and if you're using your turning chain as your first stitch of the row, I'm going to pull that stitch marker out from that last stitch, and I'm just going to stick it in the top of my turning chain right here. So that's just the top chain of my turning chain. And I'm going to place my first stitch into the next stitch. And then just go on like normal, and you would do the same thing for your last stitch at the end of the row. So when I come back around, I know that I'm going to place my last stitch in there. Okay, I've come back around. I'm placing my half double crochet. This is my second to last stitch. And now I have this guy here, and I know that I need to place one more stitch in my row. So I'm going to take that stitch marker out, and see, without the stitch marker, it's a little hard to tell where your last stitch is supposed to be. I'm just going to go into that chain right there, place my half double crochet, and I have the correct stitch count. So now suppose I'm not using a turning chain as my first stitch, and I'm placing my first stitch into that very first stitch. I'm going to just go ahead and do the same thing. I'm just going to take that guy out, place my first stitch in there, and again I'm going to place the stitch marker into the top of that first stitch. And you can get locking ones or you can get not locking ones. There's a lot of different kinds of stitch markers out there. There's super pretty fancy ones, there's handmade ones. I mean, you can really have fun with this. Look how nice that edge is. Just this tip alone, using stitch markers, will really transform your edges. And you'll be faster because you won't be trying to figure out where your first and last stitch goes, so you can confidently crochet and enjoy crocheting. Tip number 2, skip the turning chain. When we use a turning chain, we either get a weird bump on the edge or we get this gap between the first couple stitches. So instead, to keep our edges straight, we're going to use an alternative turning chain. So I'll show you how to do it with a single crochet, and then we'll move on with the taller stitches. To do an alternative turning chain with a single crochet, when you get to the end of your row, instead of chaining one, you're going to just pull up on your loop just enough to turn, just the height that a single crochet would be. And you're going to turn your work, and you're going to go back into that very first stitch. Pull up a loop and place your single crochet. That's it. That simple. And then just work down the row. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this row and the next row so I can turn around and show you what it looks like when you're working back into that stitch. So I've come back around to my alternative turning chain for the single crochet, and you can see nice and clearly that that is your next stitch. So I'm just going to work in there. Place my single crochet, and you can see how nice and clean my edge is. Look at that. I don't have any weird gaps like I do from these rows below. I don't have any weird bumps like I do from the rows below. Now for your double crochet, you're going to do something called a stacked single crochet. And I'll show you why it's called that in a second. So you're going to pull up a loop, turn, and I'm going to place a single crochet into that very first stitch, just like we did for our single crochet. But I'm going to make sure that this strand is out of my way when I do that. So I'm pulling up on it a little bit. And you want to do the same thing when you're doing a single crochet alternative turning chain. You want to make sure that that yarn is out of your way. And now I'm going to place another single crochet on top of this guy. So my single crochet has these two loops in it, right? I'm going into this loop that's furthest on the left, and I'm placing another single crochet in there. And that's it. You're just going to continue down the row with your double crochets like you usually would. You're going to start in that second stitch of the row. So I've circled back around and I'm working into my alternative turning chain for the double crochet, and I love how clear and clean it looks. You know that that is your stitch. I'm just working a double crochet in there. If it's a little tight, that means that your single crochets were a little tight. You can resolve that by just loosening up your single crochets when you're placing them in there. And there you go. Once again, you get a nice clean edge. It's not going to bump out like it would if you had a turning chain on the edge there and you don't have any weird gap. For a treble crochet and any stitch taller than the double crochet, you're going to do the same thing you did for a double crochet. You're just going to continue stacking your single crochets. So I'm going to place my single crochet in there like we did. And I'm just going to continue stacking them based on how tall my stitch is, just until I get to the height of the stitch that I'm using. I'm just going again into that leftmost loop of my single crochet. And that's it. So you just keep going based on what stitch you're using, and it will give you the same result. A really nice clean edge. So this is what your edges will look like, really nice and neat and clean. No weird bumps or gaps like we have down here. Tip number 3, cleaning up your half double crochets. Now for a half double crochet, you have two options. You can either use an alternative turning chain the same way you do for a double crochet, or you can do what I love to do. This is my favorite thing. I like to chain one. I tighten that chain a little bit, and you will see this in all my patterns that use any kind of a half double crochet. Turn my work after chaining one and tightening a little bit, and I'm going to place my half double crochet right in there. And that works for me with the patterns that I create and the yarns that I'm using, my tension and the way I crochet. It may or may not work for you. You might not like the way it looks. I love the way it looks compared to all the other options that I have. So it's totally up to you. It's just an option. I'm going to go ahead and finish the row and I'll show you what it looks like. This is what your edge is going to look like once you've chained one and done your half double crochet in that very first stitch. I think it looks pretty neat. There's no weird gaps or anything. That's the same method I've used for this scarf. You can see the edges are really nice. You're not alone if you're struggling with uneven edges on your crochet projects. It's one of the most common problems for beginners. But with a little bit of practice, you can really get your edges clean and straight. And I've got the perfect project for you to practice with. Head to the comments or the description box below and grab my free, quick and easy scarf pattern written in plain English to help you crochet a beautiful scarf without the struggle of reading a typical crochet pattern. I've included a how-to guide that details all the steps and stitches mentioned and a full video tutorial link. The link is waiting for you below. That does it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, keep crocheting with love and patience.